So this video is going to be a little bit of a change of pace, especially for the people that watch the channel every week. And this video is geared way more towards beginner woodworkers and DIYers. And that is because I think that this is a very doable project for someone with minimal skills and minimal tools to accomplish. And I know raised garden beds and gardens are very popular nowadays, as they should be. So you could save yourself a lot of money by being able to make something like this yourself, especially, and in my circumstance, they had to fit in a very specific spot, so you can customize these dimensions to anything that you want. So with that said, this video is a little bit long, and that is because I spent a lot of time showing you how to make these joints. These are cross lap joints. It's so that this has no hardware in it whatsoever. They could pop apart and be moved. Obviously, once they're full, you probably won't be moving them. But I wanted to design it in a way that it was a little nicer to look at than just butt joints. I don't love butt joints in any sort of application, really. So I tried to do something a little bit different, but not too difficult for someone who doesn't have a lot of skills to use. So the basic design of the joint is just extended laps that fit together, and you can make your lengths any dimension you want. It's a very forgiving joint if there's some gaps in it, which is nice because most people are going to be making this stuff out of dimensional lumber, which is never uniformly sized. If there's a little bit of give in it, it's not a big deal. So if you don't cut these perfectly, this design will still work. So I actually there's 4 of these, but I'm going to be stacking them by 2. So I made 2 total beds, and I'm making 3 other ones, but I decided to change the design of it because, as you can tell from the video, I wanted to make this stuff out of reclaimed lumber because I had some on hand. So it gives it a little bit more of a rustic look, but the other lumber was a little too compromised for these end joints. So there will be a second video. Depending on how my week goes, I might upload that on Wednesday showing those. But after that, I have a pretty big furniture project, a coffee table I'm making, which I'm pretty excited about. So that hopefully will be next Saturday. So this is where I got the lumber from. It actually came from raised garden beds. This is pressure treated lumber that was severely compromised at this point. I wanted to move where these were. These are long boards, so you could see that they were bowing. They actually put rebar in place to try and keep them from bowing. So I took them apart. They came apart pretty easily because they were just put together with butt joints and screws. Try to get as much dirt as possible off of them because at this point I didn't know if I was able to reuse the materials, but I wanted to gauge if I could. So this stuff was actually sitting out in the rain for quite a bit, which was a bad plan on my part. Would have been easier to work with if it was dry, but this stuff is 2 by 6 by 10s, so it's going to be 1.5 inches thick by 10 foot long by about 5.5 inches wide. If you're new to work like this, I recommend making some sort of drawing. Some people make fancy drawings on the computer. I just whipped up a quick scale drawing in my shop. I'm also reusing some pavers, and I mapped out where I wanted this stuff to go so I could figure out the exact dimensions of these boxes before starting, because like I said in the intro, I had a very specific space I had to fit all this stuff in. So this doesn't take a lot of time. You don't even have to get as fancy as this. Just a really quick drawing to figure out if you have enough space. It's not as imperative, but like I said, I went through and changed that design multiple times. So one of the reasons I don't like butt joints is end grain of lumber is where all the water is going to come in. And when you put a screw through this end here, and even if you pre-drill, a lot of times with exterior lumber over time, you could see it starts to check. The screw, especially on this end, you'll be able to see it creates all of these check marks in the wood, and then that's where the water comes in. And even though these were exterior grade screws, you could see they eventually rusted, and then they start falling apart at that point. I wanted to create something that didn't use any hardware, was self-assembled and held itself together, that was somewhat easy to make. This is going to be a longer process than butt joints. It's a little more detailed process than some other joints you could probably use, but I like the way it looked, and I like the fact that it held itself together. That was pretty important to myself. So for this material, to get it ready, I'm going to remove the rot. Rot on lumber's a lot like cancer. If you don't get rid of it, it will just spread. It will stay wet, and then the wood will just absorb all that moisture. So I had a couple tools, an angle grinder, a corded drill because it will last longer than a battery-powered drill, but obviously you can use a battery-powered drill, and then just a regular wire brush to remove this stuff. The disc in the corded drill, these little wire brush discs are under $10, worked out to be the fastest way to remove this stuff. And you could see just that initial pass. Obviously the ends are going to be in the worst condition, but it takes off all that material, and you could see fresh lumber underneath. I'm going to have some sort of sharp object in this point, a drill bit with me. If you are poking the stuff and this is not going all the way through the material, it's still fairly usable. Obviously these are going to be put back laying on the ground, and they will absorb water, but I think these are already multiple years old and they still are decent lumber, so I'm hoping to get multiple years out of them after this, and this effort will be worth it. So I will end up sanding these a little bit more at the end because I want to get all that green mold off of it so I could put some sort of clear coat or stain on it, which will protect the lumber. It's part of the reason that this got so compromised in the first place. There was no protective coating on it. So once I had this stuff ready to work, I made a simple cut list. All of my dimensions are going to be my final dimensions. So the 2 boxes I'm making for this video are 5x4. So I can go through and cut sections of this stuff in 5-foot and 4-foot sections. So for this I'm using the radial arm saw. I know a lot of people don't have these. Obviously you could cross cut these on a table saw, especially if you have a cross cut sled. You can use a circular saw to cut this stuff. There's lots of options, but in my shop, the radial arm saw is the easiest way to cut longer pieces of lumber. I also have a miter saw I could cut this sort of stuff with, but because this is 10-foot pieces, it's actually a little over 10 foot. That's not uncommon for buying dimensional lumber. So I was able to not only cut the 10-footers in half to get my 5-foot sections, I was also able to rip one of the ends off as well, remove some of that damaged wood. And then obviously this is just a close-up of that process. And then the nice thing about this is, and you could do this if you're finding reclaimed lumber, a good source for something like this will be someone who's throwing out a deck. You'll find 2x material for decks, and a lot of time deck boards are usually 1 inch thick. They're not 3/4, and you could use that for this as well. I would recommend if you're using 3/4 or inch material to not make them super big because that material will bow a lot easier. But after cutting these in half, you could see the inside of this lumber is perfectly fine. Some of these boards were newer than the others. These older boards, you can see what I'm talking about with the hardware. Where you penetrated the wood is where the water is coming in. There's that wet spot right in the middle of this board from where those screws were. So I wanted to try and eliminate that problem and make something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing for my final project. Now I had, one of the boards was too compromised to use, so I had to go out and buy 1 10-footer to complete this project. So the examples I'm going to make of this are going to be with the new pressure treated lumber, so that, because I'm assuming that is what most people are going to be using. So this is the lumber for the second project. You can see there's a lot more rot in it, so they're going to be a little bit skinnier, and like I said, I'm hoping to upload that on Wednesday. So for these cross laps, it's very simple. You're just going to be removing some chunks of material. I came in about 1.5 inches. You don't want to make that edge too thin because it will easily break off. You could go a little bit thicker, would probably even be a little bit better than this. So I came in, you could see I left 1.5 inches for my edge, and then the material is about 1.5 inches. So I measured that out, and then this, like I said, was about 5 5/8. So I came down a little bit more than 2.5 was where my center was. It was a little bit over 2 5/8.
So dimensional lumber is all going to be a little bit different. It's important to find your thickness and account for that. So the first example I have here is I'm going to just be cutting this joint out on the table saw. This is the fastest way to do this. I will give a couple other examples for people that don't have table saws, but basically I'm just lining my marks up with the table saw blade. I'm cutting right through those marks. I spent a lot of time making sure these two edge marks are perfect because those are the important dimension. The blade is risen to the height where my mark is, so like I said, I believe it was a little over 2 3/4, I believe this was. So that's how high I have the blade risen. And then once I have those two edge marks cut, I could go through and very quickly cut a bunch of kerfs. They don't have to be clean or evenly spaced. Those are just cut so that it's much more easier to remove this material. And this is pressure treated, so it's pretty wet. It's going to bend a little bit, but those curves will pop right out, and then I can clean it up with a chisel. Now, a lot of people do not like using their tools with pressure treated because it has chemicals and additives in it that will gunk up your blades. I technically was only cutting one newer board, and you can see pushing against this, it's still a sturdy joint. So I use my regular tools. The older material was really dry on the inside, so I wasn't nervous about that, but I do want to point that out. If you're using pressure treated, you don't have to. You can stain or paint. Cedar or cypress is another good option as well. It's not recommended for your tools, and this stuff does have chemicals in it, so it's important to wear dust masks and respirators. So the second example is also pretty straightforward. A lot of people own jigsaws. It's going to be the exact same process. I'm going to spend a little bit more time perfecting those two outer cuts. And then to remove the material in the center, one option is to drill a hole that's big enough to fit your jigsaw blade. At that point, you could slide the jigsaw in and cut across that horizontal, just like that. Or another way, and this is the way I usually do it so I don't have to go grab my drill, if you gradually cut closer angle cuts towards where you need to go, and then back it up and cut a little bit more, you eventually create a void or a recess, and it's big enough to twist the blade, and then I could cut across that horizontal. That's a little bit more of a learned technique. It's easy to break blades doing that, so if you're not comfortable doing that, the drill method works quite well. You're not going to get as clean of a cut with of a joint with a jigsaw cut, at least with my jigsaw, because the fence is bent, but it's still a decent joint. So another way to do this is with a circular saw. A lot of people own these. The problem is the depth of cut. Mine's only 2.5, and I believe that's pretty standard. So for the bottom, it's not going to go deep enough for what I need. For the bottom of this, I'm just going to drill a series of holes. I'm pretty good now with drilling 90-degree or close to 90-degree holes as a human can get. If you're not comfortable enough doing that, you could space yourself a little bit further away from your mark, because at the end of the day, that bottom part's going to have to be chiseled out. So if you don't get super close to your line, it's not as important. And then it's going to be the exact same process. I'm going to spend more time cutting my two ends through my pencil marks accurately, and then once that's done, I could go through and cut a series of curves and then remove all of that material. Now, because I drilled those holes on the bottom, these curves will pop out pretty quickly at this point. So be careful, make sure they're not shooting at you. And then you can see there's just a little bit of material to remove at the bottom, which is pretty easy work with a chisel. I can just go through and extend my straight cuts down to the bottom with a chisel, and then remove the material on the bottom there. So quick, easy way to clean up that joint if you only have a circular saw. And that is what that one looks like as well. You can see different methods, but at the end of the day, pretty similar results. The last method I'm going to show is a router. This one's going to take a little bit longer to set up, and it's going to be a little bit longer to do because I'm removing a lot of material. but making jigs in the shop is a versatile tool to know how to do. So the two things I'm concerned about with this is I want to make a cradle that will hold the material, and then fences that will give me repetitive cuts. So I'm just using scrap material for this. I'm using these boards because they're the same thickness as the boards I'm using, and I'm just attaching these boards real quickly. I'm using 1 5/8 inch drywall screws. And then I'm putting just an added brace on the end here. This is all scrap I have laying around the shop. So this is what I'm calling a cradle, and that is going to hold all the material. Then I need fences so that my router can ride along these fences and cut repetitive cuts. As you saw, my offset is about 3 inches. So from the end of my line, I measured about 3 inches over, and then I'm just going to attach this piece of plywood on top of here. Obviously, I'm only drilling into that backside cradle because I have to remove the boards I'm putting in and out of this in order to make the repetitive cuts. You see it slides in pretty effortlessly. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other end. Now this little L that's on the end here, that is a permanent fixture, so I can screw into that one, which is why this piece is a little bit shorter. And now I'm using a countersink bit because I keep that in my drill. You don't necessarily need that for one of these. Just make sure not to drill super close to the end of your scrap, or it will split. And then now you can see how that created 2 end stops, so I can cut out that material. The last thing I need is a depth stop. So for this one I didn't even measure, I just lined it up with my pencil mark, drew where my fence was going to be, and then added this back piece for a stop. Now the fastest way to cut all this is on the table saw, but since I spent the time making this jig for the video, I did start out with routing all of these out. And then it's not super pretty, but it was very easy to make. My router bit is deep enough that it will go all the way through. It's a pretty beefy 3/4 inch router bit with a 1/2 inch shank. So I did lift this off my table so I didn't dig into the table. You don't need necessarily a gigantic router to cut these, but it will take much longer. So if you don't have these beefier router bits, potentially pick another method. And then I'm just following along my fences and removing that material. I'm gradually doing this so I don't bog down the bit, lowering it at about 1/4 inch at a time. So it is a process. This does take a little bit longer. But the nice thing about jigs with routers is they're going to give you the best repeatable results. These will be the closest to being similar out of all the other methods. So the only problem with router bits is they're going to leave the bottom of this rounded. So same process, I have to chisel out a little bit of material, not nearly as much as a circular saw, but same sort of process. I just use a saw to extend my pencil marks to the bottom, and then I could go through with a chisel and remove that little bit of material. So those are my 4 examples. If you have a bandsaw, I do not. That is another option for cutting these. And then you could just see how nicely these slide together. Like I said, I cut these a little oversized because dimensional lumber is going to have high and low spots. I didn't want to have to worry about these being too tight. This one's pretty accurate, but you can see there is a little bit of give in it, but it doesn't affect the joint, which is nice. It's not super important that these are as tight as possible. So that is the basic joint cut 4 different ways. And now I'm just going to show you how I built these using my material. Like I said, I made this jig, so I used it. I attached it to the end of my outfeed table, so it's a little bit easier to use. And I'm also going to be adding a clamp on this. If you do not clamp this down, this board will fly on you, and then I could just cut all these. So this method will be creating a bit more end grain in the middle of the board. Now I talked about how end grain absorbs water much faster than the flat sawn surface of a board. But the plus side to this is it's not at the edge, so it won't compromise the edge. And I am going to be coating all this material with most likely a stain, and I will coat those joints with stain so the water won't easily absorb into them. You can also, and I'll show this at the end of the video, put something like construction adhesive in all of these joints, and then it won't absorb water hardly at all. So after I tried with messed around with the router for a little bit, it was a longer process. I wanted to get this done, so I switched back to the table saw. Also, some of these boards that already had compromised ends, the router flung a bit of it off on me. So I decided this was a much faster technique and I wouldn't have that issue with it flinging pieces off. So I switched back. You can see, like I said, I added a bigger board to my miter saw to make it a little bit safer of a cut, and I do have a stop on my table saw to give that initial first cut because it's all the same distance off the edge, but you don't necessarily need that. And then once I have all my curves, I could just go through, like I said earlier, and clean those up. And I cut all these boards out in an afternoon. If you're a DIYer, I think this is easily accomplished in a day or two on the weekend. So because I wanted to stain these, I had to clean up my boards a little bit more from this point going forward. I have these abrasive discs that I've been meaning to review for a company. This is not a sponsored post. I'm not advertising these at all. I haven't reviewed them yet, but I figured this was a good project to try these out on, and they worked excellently so far. You can see how quickly they remove all of this build up on the outside of the board. This is really important if you're using reclaimed materials because, like I said, you want to put some sort of finish on these so that they last longer. And if you have all this buildup on the outside of the material, the wood will not absorb that finish. This is the part that I said flung off. You could see it flung off right where that screw went in. This I can reattach, but the nice point about this joint is even if you do break off a couple ends, it will still function. And then, like I said, part of the reason I did this, because it is longer to make, but I think they're going to be more structurally sound than butt joints. I do like the way they look a little bit better. I do like the rustic look of the reclaimed material, even though it was a lot more time consuming than buying new lumber, but also the ease of putting them together. I could stack them as high as I want. Pretty simple project. So I bought this stain years ago because it was half off at Lowe's. This is most likely what I will put on the outside of the boards. The inside, I still might have to do a little bit of research on this. I'm assuming this has some sort of chemicals in it that I don't want leaching into the soil. The inside, I might try and get some raw linseed oil or something like that with no additives. And then, like I said, if you want, I'm going to be coating all the inside so this end grain doesn't absorb water, but you could also put some sort of sealant or silicone on there to really shore these up if you want. And then this is what the finished piece looks like. Antique stores will sell sort of stuff like this for hundreds of dollars, calling it rustic. Like I said, I was pretty happy with this. You can see not all the joints are perfect because some of these boards are thinner than others depending on how much material I removed, but even with the joints not being perfect, it's still structural and holds itself together.